Hello, I wanted to start out with Plato's Allegory of the Cave from the Republic, Chapter 7, and then connect that to Archimedes' notion of Eureka and how in the cave we have senses are used only to a certain extent for us to gain knowledge, and then once we have some experience, we'll see outside of the cave, that it becomes difficult then for us to return to the state of ignorance. And these aha moments, these eureka moments, then become learning experiences that, whether or not they are planned or just happen serendipitously, they alter how we look at the world, and in many ways. So I'll leave it there. Real quick, the allegory of the cave. You have individuals that are chained facing the wall. You have to almost imagine that they cannot see each other. They only really see the wall and whatever shadows are cast on that wall in front of them. The shadows are cast from a fire that is behind them, and between them and the fire is an elevated walkway. And whatever crosses the walkway then from the fire casts a shadow, and that's all they see. When one is actually released from the wall, one of the prisoners, you turn around and you start to see what things are really, how they're really being portrayed to you. And this is the realm of your senses. It's a little, disorienting. You're not quite sure what to make of it. When later in this allegory he's dragged out of the cave, you then see things as they really are. The beauty and the splendor of the world, all illuminated by the sun. Just as if we had a really good meal or we saw a really good movie, we tend to want to share those experiences and tell others of the things that we've learned. But in this instance, when this individual wants to return to the cave to tell to those people that he was, imprisoned alongside, he's nothing but mumbles and another shadow to them, so they don't recognize their old friend. So you may have had experiences like this. We all have in our lives where we mature, and it could be because of something that's dramatic has happened, a tragedy perhaps, or just some sort of a life experience that we've envisioned or witnessed, and it's altered how we look. So if somebody, one of your friends in the course of your growth has said to you, why did you have to grow up so fast? That's probably what they're trying to see. You can't go back and see things in the old way, and it's also very difficult for you to articulate exactly how what you now see is the new reality for you. So, real quick, there's a movement in the allegory of the cave from the shadows to the point where they're still in the cave and to the reality that they are now in the light illuminated by the sun. I just want to bring up a few things about each of these particular stages, if we can call them that. In the shadows, let's talk about these three things: ignorance, dullness of mind, and foolishness, as that which are enemies of education. In other words, ignorance here is not meant to be understood in the terms of rudeness. It's literally, I do not know. Now, to not know is good, but to not know that you do not know is not good. A person who thinks they knows but really doesn't becomes very difficult to be taught. So this ignorance is something that we start out with, but if we don't recognize it, we really can't move out from the shadows. Dullness of mind here is not to be understood as somebody who's just, like what we'd say colloquially, stupid. Not everybody is clear thinkers, and not everybody really understands what even an argument is. In fact, I would say most people in the modern world, and let's just say those that express themselves in social media, understand very little about the structure of an argument. It's typically nothing more than the veracity of their own outrage or such. So sometimes, even when you explain an argument, it can be very difficult for another to understand. That's something else that has to be overcome as an obstacle to education. This last thing, foolishness, is really the beginning of wisdom, says Socrates. So until a person admits they are a fool, they can never be wise. And if a person considers himself a fool and realizes how much they do not know, that's pretty wise to state. Again, not unlike ignorance, if a person is foolish but wants to be wise, that's a good thing. But if a person is foolish and thinks themselves wise, then that becomes an extreme obstacle to any sort of maturation in one's education. And I don't mean formal in the sense there. You may or may not have heard the phrase ignorance is bliss. Well, in this particular instance, to connect ignorance and wisdom, the full phrase is, if ignorance is bliss, then 'tis folly to be wise. In other words, it doesn't mean that it's better to not know. It means that if you thought it was better to not know, then why would you ever think it has some sort of meaning than to search and seek wisdom? So it's really the opposite of at least what that typical truncated phrase connotes. Now, once we start to come to a realization of how things aren't exactly how we first understood them, we're no longer, looking at the shadows that are cast on the wall as we're tied to the wall of the cave. We're now looking around and we see the mechanizations that are causing these shadows. Now, this is the realm of the senses, and this can go one of two ways for some people. Some people take comfort in the fact that I'd rather go back to the devil that I knew because it's better than the devil that I'm not sure that's out there. And that makes us very uncomfortable, too, because it's a point of anxiety. Now, when I list the anxieties of life there, I want to give the impression that that was really one of the long-term dangers as far as us understanding the most sublime things in life. Again, the things that people live and die for, what's typically known as the great ideas, the things by which we know something, beauty, truth, and goodness, and then the way that by which we apply those, liberty, justice, equality. So it's one thing to know that we are busy with our lives because it's necessary that we work to pay our mortgage, that we maintain our lawns, that we have a car that's reasonable to use and drive around and gets us to where we need to go and such. But as we oftentimes is the case in our careers, simply seek bigger houses, nicer cars, and nicer vacations, these things all require more of our time. So what happens is they're not bad things in themselves, but they detract us from seeking and searching for those higher things. So, to get too caught up in the anxieties of life, in other words, we can get more curious about the material things that we find advantageous, but they're short-lived, and we miss the things that truly make us happy. So these are the kind of things that happen when we're still in the cave, and we're not quite sure exactly, how our senses derive knowledge for us. Now, once we're out of the cave, these three things are really the purpose of education. Now, it's not to say, or I am not trying to say, that your education should not be practical in the sense that it gets you a job someday and then helps provide for you and the means of your family for the things that we all need, the goods in life. But we can't confuse education with vocation. Education should be very liberal, and by liberal here, I'm not speaking politically, I'm talking about wide and broad. So what we are after is knowledge and understanding and wisdom. But these three terms, not unlike other things that we often just spout out like everybody understands it. I've spoken about the term justice. Everybody wants justice, but we have a hard time declaring exactly what that is. So sometimes people would have a difficulty too trying to really articulate what is knowledge, what is understanding, and how do those two things differ, and then what is wisdom in relation to those. Well, just real quick, knowledge has some sort of results in some sort of judgment. So the minute I even say something simple like the grass is green, I'm making a judgment about something within the grass. I've taken the terms green and grass and I put them into some sort of propositional phrase. So knowledge is not the same as information. In social media, it's very easy for us to be, it's obviously an oversaturation of information. And you couple that with a real low participation level, and this is why we have a crisis trying to communicate anything through social media. So information are probably more akin to facts, and oftentimes we want, and we do need information, we need facts, but it's very important to understand that those are not self-interpreting. If facts and information were just self-interpreting, we would not need lawyers in civil or criminal cases. We just simply lay all the facts out on the table or put them into some sort of formula, and then off we'd come with our result. But knowledge, is a process that takes those things and then forms judgment. And let's just say that understanding is a further penetration of those. So it's one thing to know something, and then another thing to understand it. And if you want some sort of, perhaps relatable way to know that, let's say, is you've arrived at understanding when you start nodding your head. It's the I get it, all right? Now, what wisdom is wisdom is the pursuit of the highest things. So if you want to know what is the wise thing to do, it's not just because a person's older, because being older doesn't make you wise, but you'll find more wisdom in older people. Go and talk to your grandparents or great-grandparents. They're going to start telling you what is important in life. And they are going to admit that they themselves did not always act in the most prudent way that brought them to levels of happiness, and there's probably some things they wish they could redo. A wise person would take that to heart and then try to learn that now and try to do that now. So you see, that's the outside of the cave. That's the reality. Now, once you get to the point where you realize these are the most important things in life, that not the pursuit of my career, not the nice house, not the vacation or the car, but how deeply and well that I love the person I've, asked to be with me throughout my life, my children and my friends. Developing friendship is a very difficult and, let's just say, arduous process. It takes a lot of effort. Pursuing those things first is a wisdom, and you've come to that because of the information and facts that you have developed in some sort of judgment resulting in knowledge and penetrated it by understanding. If you've reached that point and somebody else is still caught up in the anxieties of life, they're going to repel you. It's the same way that the individual went back inside the cave and couldn't quite help make sense of his new revelation to his previous, we'll say his previous, friends. They were the people that he knew in his life. Nonetheless, so I want you to think of education and a lot of the things that we're going to try to do in this course as a movement from the shadows still in the cave to the reality of the light. Now, happens in sporadic ways, and in some ways, we do get to these higher levels of understanding and knowledge. In other ways, we don't. But it's difficult to not know something, and that's the point here. So just consider all of this, that we hopefully will study these sublime things. We may all have preconceptions, how these things now appear to us, especially how they relate to theology and people's particular faith expressions. And as we start to question those things, and we no longer are just looking at the shadows, but we're almost having to make some decisions ourselves in the midst of all the anxieties of life, we're going to have comfort and discomfort. It's an unraveling almost of ourselves, and we're not quite sure. We feel unstable. And the goal is to get to how things really are. And then that brings us to, obviously, hopefully, the highest level of that, which be wisdom, the contemplation of the highest things. Now, the Eureka experience, you can think of Eureka in the same way you think of aha moments or those things of discovery. Archimedes, in ancient Greece, in the city of Syracuse, was asked by the king to determine whether or not his gold crown was pure gold. Well, there was no physical way to measure this, the circumference and the surface area, to determine by the volume whether or not there was some silver mixed in or such. So this was his dilemma. The story goes that one time he was sitting in the bathtub, and as he lowered himself in the bathtub, he realized that his body displaced the water. So that gave him a thought that if he could put the crown in there and see what that displaces, and then also compare that to just pure gold and pure silver, he would be able to tell whether or not there's any impurities in that crown. So this was his aha moment. The story goes that he jumped up out of the bathtub and ran through the streets of Syracuse naked, yelling, "Eureka, Eureka." Now, these things have meaning for us, or that story has meaning for us, because it's how, again, we work through this whole idea of a learning process. But it's also important to know that Archimedes didn't just out of the blue come up with this. There was a lot of, we could say, things that presupposed his ability to be informed or to come to that sort of conclusion. And this is true for us. It's one thing to have an opinion on something. It's another thing to have an informed opinion. So everybody can have an opinion, and yes, your opinion's important because you're a human individual and you have dignity. But that doesn't mean that simply because you have dignity as a human individual that your opinion follows through as true. So with Archimedes and with us, we need to do research, which means we should start out very humble. And when we see things that come out in the news, social media, we hear stories about other people, somebody tells us about, did you know what this has happened? It's okay to take it in, but it's probably best for us to sit on it. We don't have to, know everything up front. It's okay to not know. So in Archimedes' situation, you think of the what the research he had done in the past, knowing that gold is more dense than silver, and just whatever prepared him to understand about how he'd be able to then apply that to his analogous situation of being within the tub and displacing water. So this also requires a memory. The idea that memory is important in learning is crucial. That doesn't mean that learning is memorization. It just means that one cannot learn without some level of memorization. The reality is that memory is the mother of learning. It takes this to be in the back of our head so that we don't have to relearn, or let's say, rehear something or reread something every time we're trying to put some sort of judgments together and such. The last thing is opportunity. Archimedes was not just some peasant that lived over in the village who was never, came to this particular situation. He was obviously had some influence with the king, and the king thought that he was at least wise enough that he would be able to try to tackle this. So, we're all going to have various opportunities in our lives, and we're going to have many situations where we are not the ones that have the opportunity. But nonetheless, these three things come together. So we have research, memory, and opportunity, and these things then prepare us for what lives in the future. And this isn't just using your engineering degree to help build a better pedestrian bridge across City Avenue or something. This is about making those decisions that basically require levels of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. All right, what does it mean to be a good spouse? I want to be a good parent. I mean, all those things, again, are not something we can empirically, evaluate, but nonetheless, they're very important. The second stage, if you want to call it that, is once we have developed a certain level of research and the memory, and we have the opportunity, that opportunity is really connected to an impasse. I mean, the impasse for Archimedes was the fact that he had this request by the king to figure out whether or not this crown was pure gold or not. So, we hit these bumps in the road. So when we are, up against a wall, quite literally sometimes, that's the moment where we can really shine and we can really put together all those things that, we have acquired in wisdom and knowledge and understanding over the years. And that then begins the reevaluation. We can start to see this thing in new ways, and we become creative in the ways that we work through the world. And creativity is not just limited to the artist, and it's not just limited to the people that construct things. It's creative in the way that we can be friends with other people. It's creative in the way that we can be humble. It's creative in the way that we can, let's say, respect other people regardless of, sex, creed, color, and such. So all of that basically then is just one more, step in our learning process until eventually we do reach that aha moment where we do experience this as a breakthrough. And there's an acceptance there. And an acceptance here can almost be understood in a calming. We've come to the point where, this makes sense for us. So we are now in the light. We have now seen things as they are. And this is difficult sometimes because we can't then go back and not know these things. So once that we know these things and we're with somebody who has not quite gotten out of the cave yet, think of the level of patience that has to be based in the fact that we respect that person and know that they themselves are making their own, travels outside of this, or let's say through this educational process. So this is just, a real quick grasp of how I'm hoping some things work throughout this course. The reality is that we all grow in different spurts in different aspects. There's nothing monolithic that, in life we know all these things and then we move along systematically and incrementally through these. These things always tend to change us. And the aha moments then become the learning moments where we're accepting that this is the reality. And I was simply in ignorance and perhaps had a dull mind, was foolish before. But now I can at least grow in knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. And for the, 2,000 years, that was education. That was the goal. So I only say that, again, to reinforce the idea that sometimes we look at education solely as something very practical. And we ask questions consistently, like, how will I use this? I can't imagine ever needing this. That's putting us back in the shadows. There's a certain ignorance there that's not understood. There's a certain foolishness there that's not understood as foolishness. It's almost as if the person thinks they're being wise and saying, I do not need this. So just something to keep in the back of our minds, and a little bit of a connection between Plato's allegory of the cave and Archimedes' understanding of the Eureka experience.